28 years old, and I finally decided to go back home for Christmas. Sounds wholesome, right? Wrong. This wasn't some heartwarming reunion story. This was 5 years of careful planning finally coming together. See, most people who cut contact with toxic families do it to heal and move on. Not me. I cut contact to get stronger, smarter, and more successful than every single one of them. While they spent 5 years assuming I was spiraling into failure somewhere, I was building the kind of life that would make their mediocre existence look pathetic by comparison. Let me paint you a picture of my loving family. My parents, Dwayne and Gail, never missed a chance to remind me I was their biggest mistake. My brother Brian, 3 years younger, was the golden child who could do no wrong despite dropping out of college twice. My sister Lila, the baby at 23, inherited their talent for cutting remarks and victim complex. Then there's my Aunt Audrey, Dwayne's sister, who appointed herself the family truth teller and spent every gathering listing my failures for entertainment. The breaking point came when I was 23. I had just graduated college with a business degree and decent grades. Nothing spectacular, but solid. Brian had just gotten his second DUI and crashed Dwayne's truck into a ditch. Guess who got the lecture about responsibility and being a disappointment at my own graduation dinner? Me. Because apparently my B-plus average was shameful, while Brian's legal troubles were just him finding his way. That night, Audrey suggested I should consider trade school since I clearly wasn't smart enough for real business success. Gail agreed, saying maybe I could fix cars like my grandfather and actually contribute something useful for once. Dwayne just nodded along, adding that some people aren't meant for white-collar work. Brian sat there smirking while Lila took pictures of my graduation cake, posting them on Instagram with captions about family achievements that somehow only mention Brian's potential. I smiled through the whole thing, nodded, agreed, even thanked them for their honest feedback. Then I went to my childhood bedroom, packed everything I owned into my beat-up Honda, and left before sunrise. No dramatic goodbyes, no angry confrontations, just gone. But here's what they didn't know. I wasn't running away to lick my wounds. I was going to prove every single assumption they made about me was wrong, and then I was going to make them pay for every insult, every dismissal, every time they made me feel worthless. 5 years later, I own a small but profitable consulting business that specializes in helping family-owned companies solve their operational disasters. Ironic, considering my own family is a walking operational disaster. I drive a 2-year-old BMW, live in a downtown condo, and have a client list that includes some of the biggest family businesses in the state. More importantly, I have connections. Real connections with people who matter in this town. And yes, I spent those 5 years learning everything I could about my family's lives. Social media makes it easy when you know how to look without being detected. Brian works at the same auto shop where he started after his second college dropout, makes barely above minimum wage, and still lives in Dwayne and Gail's basement. Lila bounced between retail jobs and community college classes, never finishing anything. Dwayne's small accounting practice has been hemorrhaging clients for years because he refuses to modernize. Gail works part-time at a medical office doing filing. None of them knew what I'd become. None of them had my real phone number or address. As far as they knew, I was probably living in some ratty apartment working dead-end jobs, proving them right about my lack of potential. Christmas morning 2024, I pulled into their driveway in my BMW, wearing a tailored wool coat that cost more than Brian makes in a month. I had spent weeks planning this moment, down to the exact words I would say. The gifts in my trunk weren't random. Each one was carefully selected to make a point. I walked up to the front door carrying 3 gift bags from upscale stores downtown. The kind of stores my family window shopped at but never actually bought from. Through the front window, I could see them gathered around their artificial tree in their pajamas and robes, looking exactly the same as they did 5 years ago. Older, more tired, but still convinced they were the reasonable ones in our family dynamic. Gail opened the door and just stared. She actually stepped back like she'd seen a ghost. "Mom," I said, setting down the gift bags on their coffee table. "Merry Christmas." The room went silent. Not the good kind of silent where people are surprised and happy. The kind where everyone suddenly remembers exactly why certain conversations make holidays uncomfortable. Dwayne looked up from his newspaper with that expression he always wore when I disappointed him. Brian didn't even bother looking away from his phone. Lila paused mid-bite of what looked like gas station donuts and just watched like I was performing some kind of show. Audrey, who was sitting in Dwayne's old recliner holding a mug of coffee, set it down slowly and looked me up and down. She always had this way of examining people like she was cataloging their flaws for later discussion. "Well, well," she said. "Look what the cat dragged in." I kept smiling. This was exactly what I expected, exactly what I had prepared for. 5 years of imagining this moment had made me ready for anything they could throw at me. The gifts are from some local businesses downtown, I said, like I hadn't heard her comment. I thought you might enjoy trying new things. Brian finally looked up from his phone. Nice car outside. Rental. Actually, I bought it last year. Business has been good. Now I had their attention. Gail was staring at my coat. Dwayne had folded his newspaper. Even Lila was listening instead of scrolling through her phone. Business? Audrey asked. What kind of business? I run a consulting firm that helps family companies solve their operational problems and improve efficiency. We specialize in businesses that have gotten stuck in outdated systems and need strategic guidance to compete in modern markets. The silence stretched longer this time. I could see them processing this information, trying to figure out if I was lying or exaggerating. Brian set down his phone entirely. Consulting, Dwayne said slowly. And people pay you for advice. People pay me quite well for advice, especially families who realize they need outside perspective to fix problems they've been ignoring for years. That's when I saw the first flicker of understanding in Audrey's eyes. She knew exactly what I meant by families who ignore problems. She just didn't realize yet that she was looking at one of those problems. Update 1. Some of you called exactly what would happen next. Buckle up, because this gets so much better. So there I was, standing in their living room after dropping the consulting bomb, watching Audrey's face as she processed what I'd just said about families who ignore problems. The silence was deafening, but I wasn't done. Not even close. Gail was the first to recover. She asked how long I'd been running this business, and I told her 3 years. 3 years of success they knew nothing about. I could see her doing the math, realizing I'd been thriving while they assumed I was struggling. Brian finally spoke up, asking what kind of consulting I actually do. So I explained that I help family businesses identify toxic patterns that prevent growth. I specialize in situations where one family member gets scapegoated while others get excused for identical behaviors. I help businesses recognize when they're promoting incompetence and punishing competence. The temperature in that room dropped about 20 degrees. Dwayne set down his newspaper completely and asked if I was implying something about our family. I told him I wasn't implying anything, I was stating facts. I said I learned everything I know about dysfunctional family dynamics from the experts. Them. That's when Audrey jumped in with her classic defensive routine. She said I always had a chip on my shoulder and that's why I never fit in. I was too sensitive, too proud, too unwilling to accept constructive criticism. According to her, the family had only ever tried to help me be realistic about my limitations. Here's where I'd been waiting 5 years to respond. I asked her to define constructive criticism. Was it constructive when she told me at my graduation dinner that I should consider trade school because I wasn't smart enough for business? Was it helpful when Gail suggested I should fix cars like Grandpa since I couldn't contribute anything useful otherwise? Audrey insisted she never said those things, that I was exaggerating and twisting her words, classic gaslighting. But here's the thing, I remember every word. I've replayed that conversation in my head for 5 years. Gail tried to defend Audrey by saying they were just concerned about my future. They wanted me to be practical and consider all my options. She claimed they never meant to hurt my feelings. So I asked them about Brian's options. When Brian got his second DUI and crashed Dad's truck, did anyone suggest he consider different life paths? When he dropped out of college twice, did anyone tell him to be realistic about his limitations? When he moved back into the basement at 25, was that treated as a sign he needed more practical guidance? Brian got defensive and said his situation was different. He had struggled with some personal issues and the family was supporting him through a rough patch. He said everyone deserves help when they're going through hard times. I asked why my struggles with confidence and direction at 23 didn't deserve that same support. Why was his failure treated with compassion while mine was treated with lectures about accepting reality? That's when the real truth started coming out. Dwayne said I had always been difficult to help because I took everything as criticism. He said I was defensive and proud, that I rejected their guidance and acted like I knew better than people with more life experience. But Brian and Lila never got guidance. They got excuses made for them. I was the oldest, so I was held to different standards. I was supposed to set an example and be responsible while my younger siblings got to figure things out at their own pace. Lila finally joined the conversation, saying I was making everything about me like I always did. She said the family had moved on and built good relationships with each other after I left. She claimed I was bringing up old drama that everyone else had forgotten. I told her they could forget because it wasn't their dignity that got shredded. It wasn't their achievements that got minimized, while someone else's failures got excused. They could move on because they weren't the ones who got pushed out. Audrey said I pushed myself out by being unwilling to accept feedback. She said families sometimes have to give each other tough love, and I couldn't handle it. So I asked her about tough love for Brian. Where was his tough love when he was 25 and living in his parents' basement? Where was Lila's tough love when she quit her third job in 2 years? Why was tough love only necessary for me? That's when Dwayne got angry and said I was being disrespectful. He said they had welcomed me back for Christmas and I was attacking everyone instead of enjoying family time. He told me if I came here to cause problems, I should leave. I smiled and said I wasn't causing problems. I was identifying them. That's what I do for a living now. I help families recognize destructive patterns they've been blind to for years. Gail asked why I was really there. She said if I was so successful and happy, why did I need to come back and rehash old grievances? She wanted to know what I hoped to accomplish. I told her I wanted them to understand who they had pushed away. I wanted them to see the person they decided wasn't worth investing in or believing in. I wanted them to know that their assessment of my potential was wrong, and their treatment of me said more about them than it ever said about me. Brian said I was being dramatic and that families fight sometimes, but everyone gets over it. He said I was holding grudges over normal family dynamics. Normal family dynamics don't include telling your college graduate he should consider trade school at his graduation dinner. Normal family dynamics don't include making excuses for one child's failures while lecturing another child about accepting his limitations. Audrey said I was successful now, so what was I complaining about? She claimed their tough love had motivated me to prove them wrong. So really, they had helped me succeed. I couldn't believe she was trying to take credit for my success after spending years undermining my confidence. I told her that I succeeded despite their sabotage, not because of it. I told her I built my business specifically to prove that everything they said about me was wrong. That's when Lila said something that made everything click. She said I had always been jealous that Brian and her got more support and understanding. She said I resented being the oldest and having higher expectations. I wasn't jealous of the support they got. I was angry that I got punishment where they got patience. I was angry that my struggles were treated as character flaws while theirs were treated as temporary setbacks. Dwayne said that as the oldest, I was supposed to lead by example. I was supposed to be responsible and mature while my siblings learned from watching me. He said that's just how families work, but I never got to be immature or make mistakes without lectures about responsibility and realistic expectations. I never got the grace period they gave Brian and Lila to figure things out. The gifts I'd brought were still sitting on their coffee table unopened. I told them to open them. The first bag contained artisanal coffee from a local roastery that charges $30 per pound. The second had gourmet chocolates from a boutique downtown that most people save for special occasions. The third had a gift certificate to an upscale restaurant they'd never been able to afford. I told them these were the kinds of things I buy for myself regularly now. These were normal purchases in my current life, not special splurges. I wanted them to understand the level of success I'd achieved while they assumed I was proving their low expectations right. Brian asked if I was trying to show off. I told him I was trying to show them exactly what they had dismissed and underestimated. I was trying to help them understand that their tough love had been based on completely wrong assumptions about my abilities and potential. Audrey said money didn't make me a better person and that success hadn't made me less arrogant. She said I was still the same prideful kid who couldn't take constructive feedback. I told her the feedback was only constructive if it was accurate. Telling someone with business potential to consider trade school isn't constructive, it's destructive. Lecturing someone about accepting limitations when they're 23 years old isn't helpful, it's limiting. That's when Gail said they had done their best with the information they had. She said parenting was hard, and they made mistakes. But they always tried to help me succeed. But they didn't help me succeed. They made my success harder by undermining my confidence and making me doubt my abilities. They made me feel like I had to prove my worth instead of believing I already had value. The conversation was getting heated, and I could see them getting more defensive with each point I made. They weren't ready to admit they had been wrong about me. They weren't ready to acknowledge that their treatment of me had been unfair, but I wasn't done. Not even close. I told them I had one more Christmas gift for them, but it wasn't something I could wrap in a bag. Update 2. You guys are absolutely losing your minds in the comments, and I'm living for it. The support has been incredible. Some of you guessed what was coming next. You're scary good at reading people, so there I was, telling them about my final Christmas gift, and I could see the curiosity mixed with dread on their faces. They knew something was coming, but had no idea what. I told them my gift was information. See, when you spend 5 years building a consulting business that specializes in family operations, you develop a network of connections throughout the business community. You hear things. You learn things. You start to understand how small-town business relationships really work. Dwayne's accounting practice has been struggling for years. I knew this from monitoring their social media and public business records. But I had learned much more through my professional network. Three of his biggest clients had been asking around for recommendations for new accountants. Word in the business community was that Dwayne was behind the times, inflexible with modern accounting software, and difficult to work with when clients suggested updates to his methods. I had spent 2 years quietly building relationships with business owners who knew Dwayne professionally, not to sabotage him initially, but to understand the full scope of how his stubborn refusal to adapt was affecting his reputation. What I discovered was that his business problems went much deeper than I had realized. Dwayne asked what kind of information I thought they needed to hear. I could see him getting defensive already, probably sensing this was going to be about his work. I told him that Johnson Manufacturing, his biggest client for 15 years, had been interviewing new accounting firms for the past 6 months. They were planning to make a change after tax season because they needed someone who could integrate with their new inventory management system. Dwayne had refused to learn the software integration, telling them his current methods were perfectly adequate. His face went white. Johnson Manufacturing represented about 30% of his annual revenue. Losing them would be devastating to his practice. He demanded to know how I knew that information. So I explained that Tom Johnson's son Marcus runs their operations now, and Marcus happens to be married to Sarah, who works for one of my client companies. Marcus and I had gotten to know each other through several business networking events over the past year. The conversation came up naturally when Marcus was expressing frustration about his family's accounting firm being resistant to modernization. He mentioned they were looking for someone who understood both family business dynamics and current technology integration. I had suggested a few firms that might be good fits for their needs. Dwayne was getting angry, asking if I had been deliberately sabotaging his business relationships. I told him I hadn't sabotaged anything. I had simply been present in the business community while he had been isolating himself from it. When people asked for recommendations, I gave them what they asked for, names of firms that could meet their specific needs. But here's where it gets interesting. Johnson Manufacturing wasn't his only client with concerns. I had learned through my networking that Westfield Construction had been frustrated with Dwayne's communication style for over a year. The owner, Frank Westfield, had mentioned to several people that Dwayne talked down to him and made him feel stupid when he asked questions about his financial reports. Gail was staring at me like I had grown a second head. She asked what I was trying to accomplish by telling them all this. I told her I was giving them the same kind of realistic assessment they had given me 5 years ago. They had told me to be practical about my limitations and consider my options carefully. I was helping Dwayne be practical about his limitations and consider his options. Audrey jumped in, saying I was being vindictive and cruel. She said this was exactly the kind of behavior that had caused problems in our family relationships before. I was using information to hurt people instead of being supportive. I asked her if it had been supportive when she told me to consider trade school at my graduation dinner. I asked if it was kind when Gail suggested I should fix cars because I couldn't contribute anything useful in professional work. I was simply returning the favor of honest feedback about realistic expectations. Brian said I was being petty and that business problems weren't the same as family conversations. He claimed I was comparing completely different situations, but they weren't different situations. They were both examples of people who cared about me deciding my future based on their assessment of my limitations. The only difference was that my assessment of Dwayne's professional situation was based on actual market feedback from his clients and peers, not just family bias. Dwayne wanted to know if I had told people negative things about his business. I assured him I had never said anything negative about his work to anyone. I didn't need to. His clients and potential clients were forming their own opinions based on their direct experiences with him. That's when Lila said something that really showed how little she understood the situation. She said families were supposed to support each other and that I was using my success to hurt them instead of help them. I asked her where that support had been when I needed it. When I was 23 and trying to build confidence in my abilities, where was the family support? When I was taking risks to start my business, did anyone offer encouragement or belief in my potential? She said that was different because I had been difficult to support. I had been defensive and acted like I didn't want their input. She claimed they had tried to help, but I had rejected their guidance. Their guidance was telling me to lower my expectations and accept my limitations. Their help was suggesting I pursue manual labor instead of the business career I wanted. That wasn't support. That was discouragement disguised as realism. Gail tried a different approach. She said that even if they had made mistakes in how they communicated with me, I was now successful and didn't need to hurt other family members to prove my point. She asked why I couldn't just be happy with my achievements without trying to damage Dwayne's livelihood. I wasn't trying to damage anything. I was participating in the business community that Dwayne had chosen to isolate himself from. When business owners asked for recommendations, I gave them honest assessments based on their stated needs. If Dwayne's approach to client relationships and technology wasn't meeting current market expectations, that was information the business community was sharing with or without my involvement. Dwayne said I was hiding behind technicalities and that I knew exactly what I was doing. He said I was using my position in the business community to undermine him professionally as revenge for personal family conflicts. I told him that his professional reputation was being undermined by his own choices and behaviors, not by my networking activities. His clients were frustrated with him before I ever spoke to them. His resistance to modernization was affecting his competitiveness before I started building relationships in the business community. Audrey said this proved I had been planning to hurt the family for years. She said normal people don't spend that much time and energy plotting revenge against their relatives. I asked her if normal people spend graduation dinners telling their relatives they're not smart enough for their chosen careers. I asked if normal families make excuses for one child's failures while lecturing another child about accepting his limitations. She said those were completely different situations, and that I was twisting everything to justify vindictive behavior. She claimed the family had only ever tried to help me succeed, even if their methods hadn't been perfect. But their methods hadn't been imperfect. They had been destructive. There's a difference between giving someone constructive feedback and undermining their confidence in their abilities. There's a difference between helping someone be realistic and convincing them they should aim lower. Brian said I was being dramatic and that families argue sometimes, but everyone gets over it. He said successful people don't need to prove points to their families years later. Successful people also don't typically get told at their college graduation that they should consider trade school instead of pursuing their intended career. Successful people don't usually have their achievements minimized, while their siblings' failures get excused and supported. That's when Dwayne said something that revealed exactly why this conversation was necessary. He said I had always been too proud to accept that other people might know better than me. He said my problem was that I couldn't handle being wrong or admitting I needed guidance. I asked him what he thought I had been wrong about. Had I been wrong to pursue business instead of trade school? Had I been wrong to believe I could build a successful consulting practice? Had I been wrong to think I deserved the same support and encouragement they gave Brian and Lila? He couldn't answer that question directly because answering it would require admitting that their assessment of my potential had been completely wrong. Gail said this conversation was getting nowhere and that we were all just hurting each other more. She suggested we table the discussion and try to enjoy the rest of Christmas morning. I told her I wasn't ready to table anything. I had spent 5 years waiting for this conversation and I wasn't done having it. They had made judgments about my character, my abilities, and my future that were based on bias rather than reality. They had treated my struggles differently than they treated Brian and Lila's struggles, and I wanted them to acknowledge that difference. Audrey said I was holding the family hostage with old grievances, and that this was exactly the kind of behavior that had made me difficult to deal with before. I wasn't holding anyone hostage. They were free to continue this conversation or not, just like they had been free to treat me with respect 5 years ago, or not. They had made their choices then, and I was making mine now, but I still had more information to share with them. The business networking revelations were just the beginning of what I had learned during my 5 years of building professional relationships in this community. Brian asked what else I thought I knew about their lives. The way he said it suggested he was bracing for more uncomfortable revelations. I smiled and told him he might want to sit down for the next part. Final update. Holy hell, you guys. The ending to this story is everything you hoped for and more. Thank you for following this journey with me. Your support has meant everything. So there I was, telling Brian he might want to sit down, and I could see the panic starting to set in. He knew I had been building professional relationships for 5 years, and he was smart enough to realize that meant I probably knew things about more than just Dwayne's business. I told Brian that working in family business consulting meant I spent a lot of time at the auto repair shop that handles fleet maintenance for several of my client companies. It's a bigger operation than most people realize, and they have contracts with multiple businesses around town for their vehicle maintenance needs. Brian works at Henderson Auto, which is actually a competitor to this larger shop. The owner of the bigger shop, Mike Torres, and I had gotten to know each other pretty well over the past few years. Mike loves talking about the local auto repair industry, and he had some interesting observations about how smaller shops in town were handling their business relationships. According to Mike, Henderson Auto had been struggling to keep reliable mechanics because the owner, Jerry Henderson, had a habit of promising raises and better schedules to keep people from quitting, then finding reasons to delay or reduce those promises later. Several good mechanics had left in the past 2 years because they felt jerked around. Brian was staring at me now, clearly trying to figure out where this was going. I continued explaining that Mike had specifically mentioned one situation where a mechanic at Henderson had been promised a promotion to shop supervisor with a significant pay increase. The mechanic had been doing supervisor-level work for months, while Jerry kept saying the promotion was coming soon. But then Jerry hired his nephew for the supervisor position and told the mechanic the promotion wasn't in the budget anymore. Brian asked why I was telling him this story. I could see him getting defensive, but also worried about what I might know about his specific situation. I told him that, according to Mike, that mechanic was named Brian and that he was still working at Henderson despite being passed over for the promotion he'd been promised. Mike had said it was unfortunate because Brian seemed like a good worker who was getting taken advantage of by an employer who made promises he didn't intend to keep. The room went completely silent. Brian's face had gone red, and I could see him clenching his fists. Dwayne jumped in asking what my point was with all these stories about people's jobs. He said I was gossiping about private business matters that weren't my concern. I told him my point was that I had spent 5 years hearing about my family members' lives through my professional network, and what I had learned was that Brian was getting treated at work exactly the way I had been treated at home. He was being strung along with promises that never materialized, having his contributions minimized, and being told to be grateful for less than what he deserved. Brian exploded. He said I had no right to discuss his employment situation with strangers, and that I was violating his privacy by sharing personal information about his work life. I asked him if I had shared any information, or if I had simply listened when other people brought up topics related to the local business community. I asked him if he expected me to plug my ears every time someone mentioned Henderson Auto or change the subject when business owners discussed their observations about local competitors. Audrey said I was being vindictive and cruel by throwing Brian's work problems in his face. She said this proved I was using my business connections to hurt family members instead of helping them. I asked her where that concern for feelings had been when she was throwing my career prospects in my face at my graduation dinner. I asked her if it had been cruel when she told me I wasn't smart enough for business work and should consider trade school instead. Lila said those situations were completely different because the family had been trying to help me avoid disappointment. She claimed they had given me realistic advice to protect me from failure. But Brian's situation showed that their realistic advice had been completely wrong. I had succeeded in exactly the career path they told me to abandon. Meanwhile, Brian was stuck in the same pattern they had enabled for years, accepting less than he deserved and making excuses for people who took advantage of him. Gail tried to redirect the conversation by saying we were all hurting each other and that this wasn't solving anything. She asked what I hoped to accomplish by bringing up everyone's struggles and problems. I told her I wanted them to understand that their treatment of me hadn't been based on realistic assessments or helpful guidance. It had been based on favoritism, double standards, and a complete misunderstanding of my abilities and potential. I wanted them to see that their tough love for me had been destructive, while their enabling of Brian and Lila had been equally harmful in different ways. Dwayne said I was being manipulative and using information I'd gathered to attack the family. He said this whole conversation proved that I was vindictive and couldn't let go of old grievances. I asked him if it was manipulative when they used my college grades and early career uncertainty to lecture me about accepting my limitations. I asked him if it was vindictive when they used my struggles to justify treating me differently than they treated Brian and Lila. That's when Brian said something that revealed exactly why this confrontation was necessary. He said I had always been jealous of the support he and Lila got from the family, and that I was trying to tear everyone down because I couldn't handle not being the favorite. I wasn't jealous of the support they got. I was angry that I got criticism where they got compassion. I was angry that my potential was dismissed while their failures were excused. I was angry that my achievements were minimized while their mediocrity was celebrated. Audrey said I was successful now, so I should be grateful for the motivation their tough love had provided. She said without their realistic feedback, I might have become complacent and never achieved what I had achieved. I told her that was the most ridiculous thing I'd ever heard. Their feedback hadn't motivated me. It had damaged my confidence. Their realistic assessments hadn't been accurate. They had been limiting. I had succeeded despite their sabotage, not because of it. Lila said families sometimes make mistakes, but that holding grudges for years was unhealthy. She said I needed to forgive and move on for my own good. I told her I wasn't interested in forgiveness without acknowledgement. I wasn't interested in moving on without accountability. They had made choices about how to treat me, and those choices had consequences. They were experiencing those consequences now. That's when Gail started crying. She said she didn't understand why I was being so cruel, and that they had always tried to do their best as parents. She said they loved me and didn't deserve to be attacked like this. I told her that love without respect isn't really love. Support that comes with conditions and criticism isn't really support. They had loved the idea of me conforming to their expectations, but they had never loved or supported the person I actually was. The conversation continued for another hour, with them trying different approaches to defend themselves and me systematically dismantling every excuse. They tried guilt, they tried anger, they tried reasoning, they tried playing victim. Nothing worked because I had spent 5 years preparing for every possible response they might have. Finally, I told them I was leaving. I said I had accomplished what I came to do, which was to show them exactly who they had dismissed and underestimated. I wanted them to know that their assessment of my potential had been completely wrong, and that their treatment of me said more about their character than it ever said about mine. I walked out of their house and drove away, leaving them sitting in their living room with those expensive gifts and the uncomfortable truth about their family dynamics. But here's where it gets really good, guys. 2 months later, I started getting calls. Not just regular calls, desperate, panicked, sobbing voicemails from every member of my family. Multiple calls per day, sometimes 20 or 30 in a single day. I let them all go to voicemail. The messages were incredible. Gail crying that everything was falling apart and they needed me to come home immediately. Dwayne saying he was in the hospital with stress-related heart problems and the family was destroying itself. Audrey sobbing that she was sorry and begging me to answer the phone. Lila screaming that I had to help them because everything was an emergency and they didn't know what to do. Even Brian left messages saying he was sorry and that he understood now why I had been angry all those years. Apparently, my Christmas visit had set off a chain reaction that tore their family apart. Dwayne lost 3 major clients in January, including Johnson Manufacturing, and his practice was failing. Brian finally quit Henderson Auto after realizing he was never going to get the respect or advancement he deserved, but he couldn't find comparable work elsewhere. Lila had some kind of breakdown about her life direction and was blaming everyone for not giving her better guidance. But the real issue was that my visit had forced them to confront the truth about their family dynamics. And once they couldn't ignore it anymore, they started turning on each other. They began arguing about who had been too hard on me, who had said what, who was responsible for pushing me away. The guilt and blame were tearing them apart from the inside. The voicemails got more desperate as the weeks went on. They were begging me to come back and fix everything. They wanted me to help Dwayne save his business. They wanted me to use my connections to help Brian find a better job. They wanted me to be the responsible oldest child who solved everyone's problems. The irony was beautiful. They had spent years telling me I wasn't capable of contributing anything useful to the family. Now they were desperately begging for my help because they finally understood what I had become capable of. I never returned a single call. This whole experience taught me something important about family relationships. Some people deserve your forgiveness and some people deserve your absence. Some people earn your help and some people earn your indifference. They had 5 years to reach out and rebuild our relationship. They had 5 years to acknowledge their mistakes and show that they valued me as a person. Instead, they spent those 5 years assuming I was failing and probably enjoying the idea that their tough love had been proven right. Now they know exactly what they lost when they decided I wasn't worth their respect or support. Now they understand the value of what they dismissed and the consequences of the choices they made. I'm not angry anymore, guys. I'm satisfied. They got exactly what they deserved, and I got exactly what I worked for. Sometimes the best revenge really is living well, especially when you make sure the people who wronged you know exactly how well you're living. The family disappointment didn't return to save them. The family disappointment moved on and built a life they couldn't touch, influence, or control. And that's exactly how it should be.